Hello, breeders. Welcome back to Reads with Room B. Today we will be doing Oliver Twist, and my guest reader is back.
Hello, I am Robert.
And we will be doing chapters
8
and 9. Yes. Hooray! I hate Roman numerals.
Oh, Roman numerals are the best.
No, they're not. They really are. So, Oliver walks to London, and he encounters on the road a strange sort of young gentleman. Oliver reached the stile at which the footpath terminated, and once more gained the high road. It was 8 o'clock now, though he was nearly 5 miles away from town. He ran and hid behind hedges by turns till noon, fearing he might be pursued and overtaken. And then he sat down to rest by the side of a milestone, and began to think for the first time where he had better go to try and live.
The stone by which he was seated bore in large characters an intimation that it was just 70 miles from that spot to London. The name awakened a new train of ideas in the boy's mind. London, that's great! Large place, nobody, not even Mr. Bumble, could he ever find him there. He had often heard the old men in the workhouse too say that no lad of spirit need want in London, and that there were ways of living in that vast city which those who had been bred up in country parts had no idea of. It was the very place for homeless boys who must die in the street unless someone helped him. As things passed through his thoughts, he jumped upon his feet and again walked forward.
He had diminished the distance between himself and London by a full 4 miles more before he recollected how much more he must undergo ere he could hope to reach his place of destination. At this consideration forced upon him, he slackened his pace a little, and meditated upon his means of getting there. He had a crust of bread, a coarse shirt, and 2 pairs of stockings in his bundle. He had a penny too, a gift of the Sowerberrys, after some funeral in which he had acquitted himself more than ordinarily well, in his pocket. A clean shirt, thought Oliver, is a very nice and comfortable thing, and there are 2 very darned pair of stockings, and so is a penny. But they are small helps to a 65 miles in walk in wintertime. But Oliver's thoughts, like those of most other people, although they were extremely ready and active to point out his difficulties, they were wholly at a loss to suggest any feasible mode of surmounting them. So, after a good deal of thinking to no particular purpose, he changed his little bundle over to the other shoulder and trudged on.
Oliver walked 20 miles that day, and all that time tasted nothing but the crust of the dry bread and a few draughts of water which he begged at the cottage doors by the roadside. When the night came, he turned into a meadow and creeping close under a hayrick, determined to lie there till morning. He felt frightened at first, for the wind moaned dismally over the empty field, and was cold and hungry, and more alone than he had ever felt before. Being very tired with his walk, however, very soon fell asleep and forgot his troubles.
He felt cold and stiff when he got up the next morning, and so hungry that he was obliged to exchange the penny for a small loaf, and in this very first village through which he passed through. He had walked no more than 12 miles when the night closed in again. His feet were sore, so his legs were so weak that they trembled beneath him. Another night passed in bleak, damp air made him worse, and when he set forward on his journey the next morning, he could hardly crawl along.
He waited at the bottom of a steep hill till a stagecoach came up, and then begged of the outside passengers, but there were very few who took any notice of him, and even those told him to wait till they got to the top of the hill, and then let them see how far he could run for a halfpenny. Poor Oliver tried to keep up with the coach a little way, but was unable to do it by reason of his fatigue and sore feet. When the outsiders saw this, they put their halfpenny back into their pockets again, declaring that he was an idle young dog and didn't deserve anything, and the coach rattled away and left only a cloud of dust behind.
In some villages, large boards were painted up and fixed up, warning all persons who begged within the district that they would be sent to jail. This frightened Oliver very much, and made him glad to get out of them with all possible expedition. In others, he would stand about inn yards and look mournfully at everyone who passed, a proceeding which generally terminated in the landlady's ordering one of the postboys who were lounging about to drive the strange boy out of the place, for she was sure he had come to steal something. If he begged at a farmer's house, 10 to 1 they threatened to set the dogs on him, and when he showed his nose in a shop, they talked about the beetle, which brought Oliver's heart into his mouth, very often the only thing he had there for many hours together.
In fact, if it had not been for a good-hearted turnpike man and a benevolent old lady, Oliver's troubles would have been shortened by the very same process which put an end to his mother. In other words, he would most assuredly have fallen dead upon the king's highway, but the turnpike man gave him a meal of bread and cheese, and the old lady, who had a shipwrecked grandson wandering barefooted in some distant parts of the earth, took pity upon the poor orphan, and gave him what little she could afford, and more, with such kind and gentle words, and such tears of sympathy and compassion, that they sank deeper into Oliver's soul and all the suffering he had ever undergone.
Early on the 7th morning, after he had left his native place, Oliver limped slowly into the little town of Barnet. The window shutters were closed, the streets were empty, not a soul had awakened to the business of the day. The sun was rising in all its splendid beauty, but the light only served to show the boy in his own lonesomeness and desolation, as he sat, with bleeding feet and covered with dust, upon a cold doorstep.
By degrees the shutters were opened, the window blinds were drawn up, and the people began passing to and fro. Some few stopped to gaze at Oliver for a moment or two, or turned round to stare at him as they hurried by, but none relieved him or troubled themselves to inquire how he came there. He had no heart to beg, and there he sat.
He had been crouching on the step for some time, wondering at the great number of public houses, for every other house in Barnet was a tavern, large or small. Gazing listlessly at the coaches as they passed through, and thinking how strange it seemed that they could do with ease in a few hours what it had taken him a whole week of courage and determination beyond his years to accomplish, when he was roused by observing that a boy who had passed him by carelessly some minutes before had returned, and was now surveying him most earnestly from the opposite side of the way. He took little heed of this at first, but the boy remained in the same attitude of close observation so long that Oliver raised his head and returned his steady look. Upon this, the boy crossed over, and walking up close to Oliver, said,
"Hello, Markovny. What's the row?"
The boy who addressed this inquiry to our young wayfarer was about his own age, but one of the queerest-looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy enough, and as dirty a juvenile as one would wish to see. But he had about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was short of his age, and with rather bowed legs, and sharp little ugly eyes. His hat was stuck on the top of his head, so lightly that it threatened to fall off every moment, and would have done so very often if the wearer had not the knack of every now and again giving his head a sudden twitch which brought it back to its old place again. He wore a man's coat, which reached nearly to his ankles, and he had the cuffs turned back halfway up his arms, so to get his hands out of the sleeves, apparently with the ultimate view of thrusting them into the pockets of his corduroy trousers, for there he kept them. He was altogether as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 4 foot 6, or something less, in his bluchers.
"Hello, Markovny. What's the row?"
Said the strange young gentleman to Oliver.
"I'm very hungry and tired,"
Replied Oliver, with a tear standing in his eyes as he spoke.
"I've walked a long way. I've been walking these 7 days,"
Walking 7 days?
said the young gentleman.
Oh, I see. Beak's order, eh? But
He added, noticing Oliver's look of surprise.
I suppose you don't know what the beak is, my flesh companion?
Oliver mildly replied that he had always heard a bird's mouth described in the term in question.
My eyes, how green!
Exclaimed the young gentleman.
Why, Beak's a magistrate, and when you walk by the Beak's order, it's not straightforward, but always going up and never coming down again. Was you never on the mill?
"What mill?"
Inquired Oliver.
"What mill? Why, the mill. The mill as takes up so little room that it'll work inside a stone jug, and always goes better when the wind's low with people than when it's high a cost. Then they can't get workmen, but come, said
said the young gentleman.
only one bob and a magpie.
But come, said the young gentleman, you want grub, and you shall have it. I'm at low water mark myself, but only one bob and a magpie. But as far as it goes, I'll fork out and stump. Up with you, on your pins. There. Now then, Maurice!
Assisting Oliver to rise, the young gentleman took him to an adjacent chandler's shop, where he pushed a sufficient and ready-dressed ham and half-quarterned loaf, or, as he himself expressed it, a fourpenny bran, the ham being kept clean and preserved from dust by the
ingenious expedient of making a hole in the loaf by pulling out a portion of the crumb and stuffing it therein. Taking the bread under his arm, the young gentleman turned into a small public house and led the way to a tap room at the rear of the premises. Here a pot of beer was brought in, and by direction of the mysterious youth, Oliver, falling to it, and at his new friend's bidding, made a long and hearty meal, during the progress of which the strange boy eyed him from time to time with great attention.
"Going to London?"
said the strange boy, when Oliver had at length concluded.
"Yes."
Got any lodgings?
"No."
Money?
"No."
The strange boy whistled and put his arms into his pockets as far as the big coat sleeves would let them go.
"Do you live in London?"
Yes, I do, when I'm at home.
Replied the boy.
I suppose you want some place to sleep tonight, don't you?
"I do indeed."
Oliver answered.
"I have not slept under a roof since I left the county,"
Don't fret your eyelids on that score.
said the young gentleman.
I've got to be in London tonight, and I knows a acceptable old gentleman as what lives there, and what'll give you lodgings for nothing. I never asked for the change. That is, if any gentleman he knows introduces you, and he won't, and don't he know me? Oh no, not in the least, but by no means, certainly not.
The young gentleman smiled, as if to intimate that the latter fragments of discourse was playfully ironical, and finished the beer as he did so.
This unexpected offer of shelter was too tempting to be resisted, especially as it was immediately followed up by the assurance that the old gentleman already referred to would doubtless provide Oliver with a comfortable place without loss of time.
This led to a more friendly and confidential dialogue, from which Oliver discovered that his friend's name was Jack Dawkins, and that he was a particular pet and protege of the elderly gentleman before mentioned. Mr. Dawkins' appearance did not say at vast detail in favour of the comforts which his patron's interest obtained for those whom he took, under his protection, but as he had rather flightingly and dissolute mode of conversing, and furthermore avowed that among his intimate friends he was better known as the
Sobriquet,
sobriquet.
the artful Dodger. Oliver concluded that, being of dissipated and careless turn, and moral precepts of his benefactor had hitherto been thrown away upon him, under the impression he had scarcely resolved to cultivate the good opinion of the old gentleman as quickly as possible, and if he found the Dodger incorrigible, as he more than half suspected he should, to decline the honour of his further acquaintance.
As John Dawkins objected to their entering London before nightfall, it was nearly 11 o'clock when they reached the turnpike at Islington. They crossed from the Angel into St. John's Road, struck down the small street which terminated at Sadler's Wells Theatre, through Exmouth's Street and Coppice Row, down the little court by the side of the workhouse, across the classic ground which once bore the name of the Hockley in the Hole, thence into Little Saffron Hill, and so into
Saffron Hill the Great.
Along which the Dodger scuttled at a rapid pace, directing Oliver to follow close at his heels.
Although Oliver had enough to occupy his attention in keeping sight of his leader, he could not help but bestowing a few hasty glances on either side of the way as he passed along. A dirty or more wretched place he had never seen. The street was very narrow and muddy, and the air was impregnated with filthy odours. There were a good many shops, but they were small, and the only stock in trade appeared to be heaps of children, who even at that time of night crawled in and out at the doors, or screaming from the inside. The sole places that seemed to prosper amid the general blight of this place were the public houses. In them the lowest orders of the Irish were wrangling with the might and the main. Covered ways and yards, which here and there diverged from the main street, disclosed little knots of houses, where drunken men and women were positively wallowing in the filth. From several of the doorways, with great ill-looking fellows were cautiously emerging, bound, by all appearance, to no very well disposed or harmless errands.
Oliver was just considering whether he hadn't better run away when they reached the bottom of the hill, his conductor catching him by the arm, pushing open the door of the little house near Field Lane, and drawing him into the passage, closed it behind them.
"Now then,"
cried a voice from below, in reply to a whistle from the Dodger.
"Plummy and slam,"
was the reply.
This seemed to be some watchword or signal that all was all right, for the light of a feeble candle gleamed on the wall at the remote end of the passage, and a man's face peeped out from where the balustrade of the old kitchen staircase had been broken away.
"There's two of you,"
said the man, thrusting the candle farther out, and shading his eyes with his hand.
"Who's the other one?"
"New pal,"
replied Jack Dawkins, pulling Oliver forward.
"Where did he come from?"
"Greenland's. Is Fagin upstairs?"
"Yes, he's a-sorting out the whites. Up with you."
The candle was drawn back, and the face disappeared.
Oliver, groping his way with one hand, and having the other firmly grasped by his companion, ascended with much difficulty the dark and broken stairs, which his conductor mounted with an ease and expedition that showed he was well acquainted with them. He threw open the door at the back of the room, and drew Oliver in after him.
The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle struck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf of butter, and a plate in a frying pan, which was on the fire, and which was secured to the mantel shelf by a string. Some sausages were cooking cooking, and standing over them with a toasting fork in his hand was a very old shriveled Jew, whose villainous looks and repulsive face was obscured by the quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown with his throat bare, and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and the clothes horse, over which a greater number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. Several rough beds made out of old sacks were huddled side by side on the floor, and settled around the table, where 4 or 5 boys, if I can turn the page, none older than Dodger, smoking long clay pipes and drinking spirits.
And there is our scene.
With the air of middle-aged men. These all crowded around their associates as he whispered a few words to the Jew,
And then turned around and grinned at Oliver, as did the Jew himself, toasting fork in hand.
"This is him, Fagin.
Said Jack Dawkins.
My friend Oliver Twist."
The Jew grinned, and making a low obeisance to Oliver, took him by the hand and hoped he should have the honour of his intimate acquaintance. Upon this, the young gentleman with the pipes came up and around him, and shook him by both hands very hard, especially the one which held his little bundle. One young gentleman, very anxious to hang his cap for him; another was so obliging as to put his hands in his pockets, in order that if he was very tired he might not have the trouble of emptying them himself when he went to bed. These civilities probably would have extended much further, but for a liberal exercise of the Jew's toasting fork on the heads and shoulders of the affectionate youths who offered them.
"We're very glad to see you, Oliver, very,"
said the Jew.
"Dodger, take off the sausages and draw a tub near the fire for Oliver. You're staring at the pocket handkerchiefs, eh, my dear? There are a good many of 'em, aren't there? We've just looking at 'em out, ready for the wash. That's all, Oliver. That's all."
The latter part of this speech was hailed by a boisterous shout from all the hopeful pupils of the merry old gentleman, in the midst of which they went to supper. Oliver ate his share, and the Jew mixed him a glass of hot gin and water, telling him he must drink it off directly, because another gentleman wanted the tumbler. Oliver did as he was desired. Immediately afterwards he felt himself gently lifted onto one of the sacks, and then he sank into deep sleep. And that is the end of chapter
8.
8. Yes. Congratulations. Yay. Chapter 9, containing further particular concerning the pleasant old gentleman and his hopeful pupils. It was late the next morning when Oliver awoke from a sound, long sleep. There was no other person in the room but the old Jew, who was boiling some coffee in a saucepan for breakfast, whistling softly to himself as he stirred it round and round with an iron spoon. He would stop every now and then and listen, when there was the least noise below, and when he had satisfied himself, he would go on, whistling and stirring again as before.
Although Oliver had roused himself from sleep, he was not thoroughly awake. There is a drowsy state between sleeping and waking, when you'll dream more in 5 minutes, when your eyes half open, and yourself half conscious of everything that it's passing around you, than you would in 5 nights with your eyes fast closed and your senses wrapped in perfect unconsciousness.
At such times a mortal knows just enough of what his mind is doing to form some glimmering conception of its mighty power, its bounding from earth and spurning time and space when it is freed from the restraints of its corporeal associate.
Oliver was precisely in this condition. He saw the Jew with his half-closed eyes, heard his low whistle and recognised the sound of the spoon grating against the saucepan's side, and yet his self-same sense was mentally engaged at the same time as a busy action with almost everybody he had ever known.
When the coffee was done, the Jew drew the saucepan to the hob, and standing in an irresolute attitude for a few minutes, as if he did not well know how to employ himself, he turned round and looked at Oliver and called him by name. He did not answer, and was to all appearances asleep.
After satisfying himself upon his head, the Jew stepped gently to the door, which he fastened. He then drew forth, it seemed to Oliver, from some trap in the floor, a small box which he had placed carefully on the table. His eyes glistened as he raised the lid and looked in. Dragging an old chair to the table, he sat down and took it from the magnificent gold watch sparkling with jewels.
"Ah,"
said the Jew, shrugging up his shoulders and distorting every feature with a hideous grin.
Clever dogs, staunch to the last, never told a person where they were, never peached upon old Fagin. And why should they? It wouldn't have loosened the knot, nor have kept the drop up a minute longer. No, fine fellows.
With these and other muttered reflections of the like nature, the Jew once more deposed the watch into its place of safety. At least half a dozen more were severally drawn forth from the box and surveyed with equal pleasure, besides rings, brooches, bracelets, and other articles of jewellery, and such magnificent materials, the costly workmanship, that Oliver had no idea even in their names.
Having replaced these trinkets, the Jew took out another, so small that it lay in the palm of his hand. There seemed to be some very minute inscription on it, for the Jew laid it flat upon the table, and shading it with his hand, pored over it long and earnestly. At length he put it down as if despairing of success, and leaning back in his chair, and muttered,
"What a fine thing capital punishment is! Dead men never repent. Dead men never bring awkward stories to light. It's a fine thing for the trade. 5 of 'em strung up in a row, none left to play booty or turn white-livered."
As the Jew uttered these words, his bright dark eyes, which had been vacantly staring before him, fell on Oliver's face. The boy's eyes were fixed on his in mute curiosity, and although recognition was only for an instant, for the briefest space of time that it can possibly be conceived of, it was close enough to show that the old man that he had been observed. He closed the lid of the box with a loud crash, laying his hand upon the bread knife which was upon the table, and started furiously up. He trembled very much, though, for even in his terror, Oliver could see the knife quivered in the air.
"What's that?"
said the Jew.
What do you watch me for? Why are you awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy! Quick, for your life!"
"I wasn't able to sleep any longer,"
replied Oliver meekly.
"I am very sorry if I have disturbed you, sir,"
"You were not awake an hour ago,"
said the Jew, scowling fiercely on the boy.
No, indeed,"
replied Oliver.
"Are you sure?"
cried the Jew, with still a fiercer look than before, and a threatening attitude.
"Upon my word, I was not, sir,"
replied Oliver earnestly.
"I was not indeed, sir,"
Tush, my dear,"
said the Jew abruptly, resuming his old manner and playing with the knife a little before he laid it down, as if to induce the belief that he had caught it up in a mere sport.
"Of course I know that, my dear. I only tried to frighten you. You're a brave boy. Ha ha ha! A brave boy, Oliver."
The Jew rubbed his hands with a chuckle, but glanced uneasily at the box notwithstanding.
"Did you see any of these pretty things, my dear?"
said the Jew, laying his hand upon it after a short pause.
"Yes, sir,"
replied Oliver.
"Ah,"
said the Jew, turning rather pale.
"They're mine! Oliver, my little property, and all I have to live upon in my old age. The folks called me a miser, my dear. Only a miser, that's all.
Oliver throughout thought the old gentleman must be a decided meister to live in such a dirty place with so many watches, but thinking that perhaps his fondness for the Dodger and the other boys cost him a good deal of money, he only cast a deferential look at the Jew and asked if he might get up.
Certainly, my dear, certainly,
replied the old gentleman.
Stay, there's a pitcher of water in the corner by the door. Bring it here, and I'll give you a basin to wash in, my dear.
Oliver got up, walked across the room, and stood in stooped for one instant to raise the pitcher. When he turned his head, the box was gone. He had scarcely washed himself, and made everything tidy by emptying the basin out of the window, agreeably to the Jew's directions, when the Dodger returned, accompanied by a very sprightly young friend, whom Oliver had seen smoking on the previous night, and who was now formally introduced to him as Charlie Bates. The four sat down to breakfast, had on coffee and some hot rolls and ham, which the Dodger had brought home in the crown of his hat.
Well,
said the Jew, glancing slyly at Oliver and addressing himself to the Dodger.
I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears.
Hard,
replied the Dodger.
As nails,
added Charlie Bates.
Good boys, said
the Jew.
What have you got, Dodger?
A couple of lined pocketbooks,
replied the young gentleman.
Lined?
Inquired the Jew with eagerness.
Pretty well,
replied the Dodger, producing two pocketbooks, one green and the other red.
Not so heavy as they might be,
said the Jew, after looking at the insides carefully.
Very neat, nicely made, ingenious workmanship, ain't he, Oliver?
Very indeed, sir,
said Oliver, at which Mr. Charlie Bates laughed uproariously, very much to the amazement of young Oliver, who saw nothing to laugh at in anything that had passed.
And what have you got, my dear?
said Fagin to Charlie Bates.
Wipes,
replied Master Bates, at the same time as producing 4 pocket handkerchiefs.
Well,
said the Jew, inspecting them closely.
They're very good ones, very. You haven't marked them well, though, Charlie, so the marks shall be picked out with a needle, and we'll teach Oliver how to do it. Shall us, Oliver, eh?
If you please, sir,
said Oliver.
You'd like to be able to make pocket handkerchiefs as easy as Charlie Bates, wouldn't you, my dear?
said the Jew.
Very much indeed, if you'll teach me, sir,
replied Oliver.
Master Bates saw something so exquisitely ludicrous in this reply that he burst into another laugh, which laugh, meeting the coffee he was drinking and carrying it down some wrong channel, very nearly terminated in his premature suffocation.
That's a bit foolish, but we've all done it. He is so jolly green,
said Charlie when he had recovered, as an apology to the company for his unpolite behaviour.
The Dodger said nothing, but he smoothed Oliver's hair down over his eyes, and said he knows better by and by, upon which the old gentleman, observing Oliver's colour mounting, changed the subject by asking whether he had been much of a crowd in at the execution that morning. This made him wonder more and more, for it was plain from the replies of the two boys that they had both been there, and Oliver naturally wondering how they could possibly have found time to be so very industrious.
When breakfast was cleared away, the merry old gentleman and the boys played at a very curious and uncommon game, which was performed in this way. The merry gentleman, placing a snuff-box in one pocket of his trousers, a note-case in the other, a watch in his waistcoat pocket, a guard chain around his neck, sticking a mock diamond pin in his shirt, buttoned his coat tight around him, and putting his spectacle case and handkerchief in his pockets, trotted up and down the room with a stick, in an imitation of the manner in which an old gentleman would walk the streets of any hour of the day. Sometimes he stopped at the fireplace, and sometimes at the door, making believe he was staring with all his might into shop windows. At such times he would look constantly around him, for fear of thieves. He kept slapping at all of his pockets in turn, to see he hadn't lost anything, in such a very funny and natural manner that Oliver laughed till tears ran down his face. All this time the two boys followed him closely about, getting out of his sight so nimbly every time he turned around that it was impossible to follow their motions. At last the Dodger trod upon his shoes or ran upon his boot accidentally, while Charlie Bates stumbled up against him behind, and in that one moment they took from him the most extraordinary rapidity the snuff-box, note-case, watch-guard, chain, shirt-pin, pocket-handkerchief, even the spectacle case. If the old gentleman felt a hand in any of his pockets, he cried out where it was, and then the game began all over again.
When this game had been played a great many times, a couple of young ladies called to see the young gentleman, one of whom was named Bet, and the other Nancy. They wore a good deal of hair, not very neatly turned up behind, and were rather untidy about. The shoes and stockings they were not exactly pretty. Perhaps they had a great deal of colour in their face, and looked quite stout and hearty, being remarkably free and agreeable in their manner. Oliver thought them very nice girls indeed, and they are no doubt that they were.
These visitors stopped a long time. Spirits were produced, in consequence of the young lady's complaining of the coldness in her insides, and the conversation took a very convivial and improving turn. At length Charlie Bates expressed his opinion that it was time to pad the hoof. This occurred to Oliver that it must be French for going out, for directly afterwards the Dodger and Charlie and the two young ladies went away together, having been kindly furnished by the amiable old Jew with money to spend.
"There, my dear,"
said Fagin.
"that's a pleasant life, isn't it? They've gone out for the day."
"Have they done work, sir?"
inquired Oliver.
"Yes,"
said the Jew.
"that is, unless they should unexpectedly come across any when they are out, and they won't neglect it. If they do, my dear, depend upon it."
Make
'em your models, my dear, make 'em your models,"
said the Jew, tapping the fire shovel on the hearth to add force to his words.
"Do everything they bid you, and take their advice in all matters, especially the Dodger's, my dear. He'll be a great man himself, and will make you one too, if you take his pattern. Is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?"
said the Jew, stopping short.
"Yes, sir."
said Oliver.
"You see if you can take it without my feeling it, as you saw them do while we were at play this morning."
Oliver held up the bottom of the pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger hold it, and drew the handkerchief lightly out with the other.
"Is it gone?"
cried the Jew.
"Here it is, sir."
Oliver showing it in his hands.
"You are a clever boy, my dear,"
said the playful gentleman, patting Oliver on the head approvingly.
"I never saw a sharper lad. Here's a shilling for you. If you go on this way, you'll be the greatest man of the time. And now come here, and I'll show you how to take the marks out of the handkerchiefs."
Oliver wondered what picking the old gentleman's pockets in the play had to do with his chances of being a great man, but thinking that the Jew being so much his senior, must know best, he followed him quietly to the table, and was soon deeply involved in his new study.
And that ends our chapters for today. We will see you next time. Until then, be excellent, stay safe, and keep reading. Bye for now.